Welcome to Grace Beyond Measure, a place where we pause amidst the chaos. Today, we step into a quiet space, a sacred time dedicated entirely to your soul. If you are looking for a meaningful Christian story time or soothing Jesus stories for sleep to comfort your mind, you are exactly where you need to be. Let your shoulders drop. Take a deep breath in and exhale all the worries of today. We are about to listen to a relaxing Bible narrative, a story from history that still speaks directly to our hearts today. This is a moment for reflection, a moment for finding peace in God.
The air around the Sea of Galilee was heavy. It was not just the heat of the Mediterranean sun. It was the sheer exhaustion of a broken people. It was an era of iron and dust. The shadow of the Roman Empire stretched long and cold. It covered the hills of Judea and Galilee. The Jewish people were the heirs to the promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yet they were strangers in their own land. They were crushed by heavy taxes. They were policed by foreign soldiers. And above all, their souls were parched. For generations, they had waited for the roar of a lion. They hungered for a military messiah, a king who would use a sword to shatter the Roman yoke. Meanwhile, the religious elite offered only rigid laws, a system of strict rules that offered no comfort. It only left the common people feeling crushed. They could never meet such impossible standards. Whispers traveled faster than merchant caravans. It spoke of a carpenter, a man from the small, dusty village of Nazareth. His name was Jesus. He carried no sword. He wore no fancy robes. And when he taught, the earth seemed to hold its breath. He healed the sick with a gentle touch. He drove out demons with a single word. Fishing boats of Capernaum to the busy streets of Jerusalem. A massive crowd gathered. They dragged their tired bodies, their broken dreams, their empty hearts. They walked north, hoping to witness a new Jesus Sea of Galilee story. They did not know it yet. They were walking toward a mountain where the order of the world would be turned upside down. The morning sun crested the eastern hills. It painted the waters of Galilee in strokes of crushed gold. At the base of a gently sloping mountain, the crowd swelled. Thousands were there. It was a living mosaic of human pain and desperate seeking. There was Miriam, a widow from the town of Nain. Her clothes were threadbare, covered in the dust of fields she did not own. In her world, a woman without a husband or a son was invisible. The world called her cursed. Her pockets were empty. Her soul felt hollow. She came to the mountain because she simply had nowhere else to go. Far away from Miriam stood Elias, a chief tax collector. His robes were made of expensive purple silk. A heavy leather purse jingled with silver coins at his side. Yet he stood on the edges of the crowd. His shoulders were slumped. To Rome, he was a useful tool. To his own people, he was a traitor, a parasite. He had enough wealth to buy a palace, but he was drowning in self-loathing. He knew his money could never buy him peace. And near the front stood Ezra, a young Pharisee. His clothes were immaculate. The tassels on his robe were perfectly tied. He fasted twice a week. He knew the scriptures by heart. Yet behind his perfect mask of religion, Ezra was exhausted. Performing holiness every day was a crushing burden. He secretly feared that God was a harsh judge and that his good deeds would never be enough. Beggars missing limbs, mothers holding sick children, fishermen smelling of salt. They all pressed forward, crushing the wild mustard plants beneath their feet. All of them were looking up at the man who was climbing the hill.
Jesus walked ahead of the crowd. His steps were even and deliberate. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He moved with the quiet authority of a true king, even though his crown was only the wind, and his robe was made of rough cloth. His disciples followed closely, nervous and overwhelmed by the desperate masses. Jesus reached a natural plateau on the mountainside. The landscape formed a perfect acoustic theater. It sloped gently down toward the glittering sea. Here, wild lilies bloomed against the rocks. Birds darted through the branches of olive trees. Jesus stopped. He turned to face the vast ocean of humanity below him. In the ancient Jewish tradition, a rabbi would stand to read the law, but a rabbi would sit down when teaching with ultimate authority. Jesus gathered his cloak, he bent his knees, and he sat upon the earth. The movement was subtle, but it sent a shock wave through the crowd. The shuffling of thousands of sandals suddenly stopped. The murmurs and whispers died away in the wind. Crying children were hushed against their mothers' chests. A profound, charged silence fell over the entire mountain. It was time for the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus looked at them. His gaze did not just sweep over the crowd. Ezra felt Jesus looking right through his righteous disguise. Elias felt Jesus looking at the guilt staining his hands. Miriam felt Jesus looking into the aching void in her chest. He saw their poverty, not just their lack of money, but the deep, agonizing poverty of the human condition. The realization that they were completely incapable of saving themselves. Jesus opened his mouth. Blessed are the poor in spirit. His voice was not a shout, but it carried perfectly over the grassy slopes. It reached the furthest edges of the crowd. It was a voice of deep resonance, carrying the warmth of a carpenter and the authority of the Creator. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. A collective breath was drawn in, followed by stunned silence. The crowd blinked in pure confusion. This was not how the world worked. In the logic of Rome, the blessed were the powerful, the rich, the proud. In the logic of religion, the blessed were the perfect, the flawless. But the opening line of the Beatitudes presented a beautiful paradox. To understand the true meaning of poor in spirit, we must look at his words. Jesus did not use a word for a common, hard-working peasant. The word he used meant a beggar, someone utterly destitute, cowering in the shadows. Someone who has absolutely nothing to offer, completely reliant on mercy to survive. He was saying, "Blessed are the spiritual beggars." He was declaring, "Blessed are those who know they have nothing to offer God. Blessed are those who look into their own souls and see empty pockets. Blessed are those who stop trying to earn their salvation, who abandon their pride, and who come to God with open, empty hands."
This is the radical core of Jesus' teachings.
Ezra, the Pharisee, recoiled. Blessed are the poor in spirit? All his life, he had tried to be spiritually rich. He hoarded his good deeds like a merchant hoarding gold. He built a fortress of morality to prove he was worthy. But Jesus was saying his spiritual wealth was fake. The kingdom of heaven is not a marketplace. You cannot buy entry with a perfect religious record. It is a gift. And a gift can only be received by hands that are completely empty. As long as Ezra clutched his pride and his rules, his hands were too full. For the first time, Ezra felt the crushing weight of his religious armor. A terrifying, beautiful thought pierced his mind. What if I just take it off? On the fringes of the crowd, Elias the tax collector wept. A hot tear tracked through the dust on his cheek. He had come to the mountain expecting to be condemned. He knew his sins were a mountain he could never climb. But the master was saying that this exact realization was the key. His devastating awareness of his own spiritual poverty was his ticket in. So who are the poor in spirit? It was Elias. He did not have to clean himself up first, because he could not. His desperate cry for mercy was the only requirement. The kingdom belonged to him, not because he was good, but because he knew he was broken, and he begged for grace. And what of Miriam? She sat on the grass, her thin hands trembling in her lap. For years, she was told her poverty was a sign of God's anger. She felt cast aside by the Almighty. She had nothing left to give. No sacrifices for the temple, no status to claim. The words of Jesus washed over her like cool water on a burn. Blessed are the poor in spirit. He was speaking directly to her. He looked at her shattered life and called it a blessing. Why? Because a vessel full of itself has no room for God. A heart that thinks it is strong does not cry out for a savior. Miriam was empty, yes, but that meant she was hollowed out enough to be filled by God himself. Her lack of earthly security had stripped away all her illusions. She had nothing but God. And Jesus was declaring that God was enough. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If you are doing a Matthew 5 Bible study, do not miss this. Jesus did not say the kingdom will be theirs in the distant future. He used the present tense. Theirs is. The kingdom of heaven was not just a place they go when they die. It was the ruling presence of God breaking into their reality. Right here, right now. It is found in the sheer grace of a God who stoops down to lift the beggar from the ashes. As Jesus continued his sermon, he moved through the other blessings. Blessed are those who mourn, the meek, the hungry. But this foundational truth anchored everything. As a Sermon on the Mount summary, everything starts right here. Blessed are the poor in spirit. It is the gateway to all grace. You cannot mourn your sin if you do not first realize you are spiritually poor. You cannot be meek if you are puffed up with pride. You cannot hunger for righteousness if you believe you are already full. These are the Beatitudes explained in their purest form. Jesus was exposing the greatest deception of the human heart, the belief in self-reliance. The world says, climb the ladder, hide your weakness, prove your worth. Jesus says, climb down, step off the pedestal. This is the ultimate Christian motivation. Bring me your empty hands, your failures, your desperate need. To be poor in spirit requires the death of the ego. It means looking into the mirror and saying, I am a sinner, and I cannot save myself. But the promise attached to this surrender is the greatest treasure, the infinite, overflowing grace of God. God does not deal with the proud. They are too full to receive him. But he rushes like a torrential river into the valleys, into the low places, into the hearts of the poor in spirit. The sun began to dip low in the western sky. Long, purple shadows stretched across the Sea of Galilee. The Sermon on the Mount had concluded. Jesus stood up. He wrapped his cloak around him, and he began the slow descent down the mountain. The crowd began to disperse, but the atmosphere was forever changed. The people were quiet. They walked thoughtfully, carrying a weight that was somehow lighter than air. Miriam walked back toward Nain. She still wore her threadbare cloak. She still had no money, yet her head was held high. The shame was gone. She was a daughter of the king, and the kingdom was hers. Elias, the tax collector, walked toward the town. His hand no longer guarded his money purse. He knew what he had to do. He would repay what he stole. He had found a wealth that could not be taxed or stolen. The pure forgiveness that comes to those who beg for it. And Ezra the Pharisee stood alone on the mountainside. He watched Jesus disappear into the twilight. With trembling hands, Ezra unfastened the religious boxes tied to his forehead. He let his pride drop into the dust. He fell to his knees in the wild mustard plants, weeping freely. "Lord," he whispered into the gathering dark. His hands turned upward, completely empty. "I have nothing." And in the silence of the Galilean evening, the wind seemed to carry the Master's voice. "Blessed are you then, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." A planta takes one bean, it adds another 5. Stars continue far. Suns lock tight long. Time of little gone small. Tale of queer quiet. Tale of poor poor. Sand continues far. Suns lock tight long. Flowers flow far. 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 Please join us on Grace Beyond Measure. We hope this Bible story brings you comfort, peace, and a quiet mind. Remember, sometimes being completely empty is the only way to be truly filled. May God grant you peace